Welcome to the lesson. Why does the Federal Reserve hate workers? The Federal Reserve Bank, or any central bank, regulates credit and influences interest rates to help reduce inflation or to encourage firms to hire more workers. But the Federal Reserve tools are blunt, like a hammer. They can't really target areas to help or hurt. In times of inflation in one area, say oil, the Federal Reserve can only raise interest rates to slow consumer demand for oil, but that slows down the economy everywhere. In other words, the Federal Reserve engineers a recession to slow the economy. A recession causes high unemployment, which reduces worker bargaining power. We'll discuss how the Federal Reserve affects bargaining power with a great deal of political independence. The governors are independent of any one president. The governors and chair have 6-year terms. This lesson contains a case study of how the Fed engineered a recession and caused unemployment with the aim of fighting inflation. The Vocal Recession in the early 1980s. Paul Volcker, a New Jersey-born economist, served as Federal Reserve Chair for 12 years. He was appointed by Democrat Jimmy Carter and Republican Ronald Reagan. Volcker engineered a recession that hurt a lot of people. Yet this severe 1981-1983 recession, referred to as the Vocal Recession, was called a great success. Why? Because the deep recession stopped inflation by knocking the life out of workers and businesses' expectation that prices would always increase. These expectations can lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. Inflation started in response to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which caused the global oil supply to fall and prices to rise sharply between 1979 and early 1980. Countries such as the United States, Canada, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, and Japan experienced huge rates of inflation and political uproar over gas prices. In response, the central banks, including the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, increased interest rates. The Fed's reaction to inflation caused the Vocal Recession. High interest rates curb economic demand. For example, when farmers or any debtor face higher interest rates, their purchasing power falls. Home buying declines because mortgage rates are high, and businesses slow down or stop investing. Lower demand puts less pressure on prices. The severe increase in interest rates during the Vocal Recession caused even steeper and longer periods of economic contraction. Economies got the worst of both worlds, stagflation. Inflation is when employment stagnates and prices continue to inflate. Volcker knew inflation and recession hit workers from both sides, higher prices and more unemployment. But since curbing price increases was Volcker's major goal, he engineered a situation where workers had less power to get a wage increase. Volcker knew what he was doing. He said to a New York Times reporter in October 1979, "The standard of living of the average American has to decline." He said, "I don't think you can really escape that." The Volcker-led Federal Reserve Board raised the federal funds rate to a peak of 20% in June 1981. Mortgage rates were over 10%. These high interest rates led to the 1980-1982 recession, when the U.S. unemployment rate rose to over 10%. Unsurprisingly, indebted farmers drove their tractors and blockaded the Washington, D.C. streets. The Reagan administration and Congress worked hard to undo the tight monetary policies. How did the president and Congress help reduce unemployment? By running large federal deficits to stimulate the economy through tax cuts and, unfortunately, major increases in military spending. Now, Jerome Powell, chair of the United States Federal Reserve Board in 2022, is another example of the Fed trying to engineer a recession to curb inflation. They would like not to cause a recession, but they will risk it. Central banks' reactions to inflation and strategies are the same worldwide. The Federal Reserve decision makers use complicated theories to guide their decisions, but one model rules them all. The so-called Phillips curve was named after an engineer who saw that price increases were small when unemployment was high. In the 12 months ending in May 2022, wages went up 5.6%, but prices went up 8.6%. The relationship between unemployment and prices has become weaker. Unemployment rates can be low while workers' wage increases, and in contradiction to the Phillips model, be also low. Price increases can remain small. Conventional wisdom has said that the Vocal Recession conquered inflation and buried the Phillips curve. But a 2022 study by Federal Reserve economists indicates another theory. Interest rates had done their thing, meaning they had their expected effect. But a more important set of policies affected the American economy in the last 20 years, and another important set of policies crushed inflation. It was anti-union labor market policies that eroded worker bargaining power that helped crush inflation. Ironically, the findings of internal Federal Reserve economists did not have much effect on Jerome Powell. Even though the researchers found that the wage price spirals are not important, that the decline in bargaining power of trade unions reduces their share of monopoly profits that go to workers, and this explains why the share of GDP going to workers has declined in the US and all over the globe. University of Texas economist James Galbraith argues that when the Fed engineers a recession, it reduces worker power and wages. In 2022, U.S. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell chose to repeat the Paul Volcker strategy. Economist James Galbraith asserts that Powell's commitment to raising interest rates will not do much to counteract inflation in the following year. Powell's actions will only suppress price increases by creating an economic crash. Professor Galbraith and I had raised a concern about low interest rates. What concern might that be? With super low interest rates, consumers and speculators might load up on cheap debt. This cheap debt has people scrambling to buy houses, land, companies, internet startups, and cryptocurrencies. These so-called assets have inflated values, which makes the system pretty fragile. For example, the increase in mortgages and subprime loans caused a worldwide financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. But just because these are problems with low interest rates doesn't mean that high rates will solve that problem. Inflation statistics may not be the best way to measure a problem. First, we have to determine what the problem is. Professor Galbraith points out that the current bout of so-called bad inflation numbers is an overhang from a pandemic and 20 years of war. How will a recession possibly help the effects of war and actually the pandemic virus? World oil prices and bottlenecks in the supply chain are the main reasons for inflation that we see in 2022. What else is the problem? People with money and credit are chasing a limited number of houses on the market. They're desperate to get a land asset, and that caused housing prices to increase, and that added to inflation. Inflation numbers do, however, create a certain kind of politics. Headlines about inflation can linger long after inflation drops. The political and media effect is a bonus and a win for inflation hawks, who cheer for a recession to stop inflation. Hawks are predators, and there is only one source of prey that will satisfy their appetite to lower inflation to, say, 2% per year. By slowing the economy now, the Fed hopes that workers' bargaining power to get higher wages will weaken. Lower wages will offset rising energy and supply chain costs that are now paid for by business revenues and profits. Professor Galbraith is concerned that the Fed fears that workers have too much bargaining power, but he says a little inflation caused by workers' wages going up could be a good thing. Suppose employers in services like leisure and hospitality have been forced to raise wages above inflation to lure workers back into the labor market. In that case, that inflation should not have concerned the Fed. High-income earners tend to buy disproportionately more services. So, as Professor Galbraith writes in the reading I have assigned, higher income people will pay more to lower income people. Why is that kind of inflation a bad thing? I share Professor Galbraith's conclusion and concern that the Fed is determined to stop rising wages and that won't be a good thing for the economy. I interviewed economist James Galbraith for him to explain the history of the Fed's war on workers. Let's discover what he has to say. Professor Galbraith, we're interviewing you in 2022, and inflation is big news. Why is inflation only coming up now?
Why did inflation disappear? There are three main reasons. One is that the labor movement in the United States was crushed in the early 1980s, so the wage pressures came off. The second was that commodity prices went way down particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening up of world commodity markets. And the third was the rise of China, which provided a floor or put a ceiling really on the prices of a lot of manufactured goods sold in this country. So we went through 40 years with very little price pressure and very little capacity for inflation to be a problem. Why has it come back? Well, things got disrupted. And the main thing that got disrupted was energy. And the main reason energy got disrupted initially was the pandemic, with very likely combined with, let's say, a coming to an end of the big phase of the fracking boom, so that when the pandemic ended or when the demand recovered, there was the price of oil and of gasoline went up very, very sharply, and that fed into practically everything else, food, and then into all other aspects of the cost of living, and that's what we're seeing now by and large.
You wrote that there is a somewhat mysterious or unfounded theory about how interest rates are related to the price level. Can you tell me what that theory is? Why is it wrong and why it might be dangerous?
This is related loosely to the idea that increases of the money supply, allegedly controlled by the central bank, feed through to the price level in some direct way. And the interest rate is the tool that the central bank uses to control the money supply. Well, that's not the way the world works. It's not the way central banks actually work. The interest rate is, in fact, a price. It's a price which affects the borrowing costs for business and affects mortgage rates for homeowners. It affects lots of things. When the central bank goes about raising interest rates, the first thing that happens is that these costs go up, and that's going to actually aggravate the inflation problem. Ultimately, if you get a big enough shock from interest rates and you completely clobber construction and other investment and let's say buying on credit from consumer durables, then unemployment goes up, and the economy can be brought down to earth and into it basically can be crashed that way. But that first of all takes time. It's exceedingly painful, and it's exceedingly unfair.
You wrote that prices going up in restaurants, the hospitality sector, in services, may actually be a good thing for income and wealth distribution, and really should not be a concern of the Federal Reserve, but in fact embraced that prices are going up in those sectors. What did you mean by that?
Well, I wish that the wages for low-wage American workers were going up faster than prices, but they're not. They're at best playing a very limited catch-up. And to treat this as the problem is, the reality is the central bank serves the interests of the financial sector. Whatever the law says, that's the way it has always been. Those who are working, as you say, in the hospitality sector or in some other sectors where they're going to lose their jobs are going to be the first to pay the price.
Yeah. And there was something about people who really use those services, paying higher prices. I remember that in your piece, that it's actually wealthy people who use services at a greater proportion of their budget than poorer people. So if they're paying more for their services, it might help out income distribution.
Yeah, well, there would be nothing wrong with a society in which low-paid people were paid more and high-paid people earned less. This is the problem that we have. I mean, I'll go back to Adam Smith, who's my favorite sentence in the entire Wealth of Nations is, "Wealth, as Mr. Hobbes says, is power." And Mr. Hobbes says puts a real punch into that sentence. This is the problem we've had. We had an immense concentration of wealth in the hands of very small groups of people, mostly in finance and technology. These are names everybody knows. And this has a disastrous effect on the capacity of the broader society to influence its government, to influence the kinds of policies that we all need.
The last question we have is for people who might be taking this course are wondering how the Fed really affects their lives. And we both teach a lot of young people who are just starting their careers and their lives. Why should they care about Fed policy and interest rate theories? And how might what's happening now with the Federal Reserve and the theories that they base their policies on affect the people we teach, the young people in college, getting a job after graduation?
Well, the central bank is an important power center that controls the supply of unemployment. It controls it has a strong effect on the ability of the economy to deliver opportunities to everybody. Under the Constitution and laws of the United States, the Central Bank of the United States is a creature of Congress. It is subject to the law and direction of the people's legislature. And it's not an independent institution as many economists and textbooks pretend it is. So this is very important, I think, for young people to recognize. There's a statute, it's called the Federal Reserve Act. I participated in adding language to that statute. That statute specifies that the task of the Federal Reserve is to promote full employment and reasonable price stability. It's not simply to control prices, and it's not simply to serve the banking system. It acts in practice in a way which is largely contrary to the law. So young people who are interested in this should appreciate that the Constitution and the law are on your side. The banking sector and the economists are not on your side. And this is a political struggle that I hope the next generation will also take up.
Yeah. No, it seems like the Federal Reserve has taken employment levels seriously, and it decides that its tool is to cause more unemployment. And that's an important tool. And it's not, as you say, in the law, they're supposed to actually help an economy provide a job for everyone who wants one.
Absolutely. And as someone who helped draft that law, I insist on that it should be the dominant and the controlling factor.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
It's a pleasure. Always good to see you. Thanks a lot.
In this lesson, we discussed the role of the Federal Reserve Bank and the impact interest rate hikes have on triggering a recession. In particular, the recession engineered by Paul Volcker back in 1980s and the resulting impact on workers' bargaining power then. This wraps up our Power at Work module. Next, you'll have the opportunity to check your knowledge about power in the economy.